Hi, I'm Dr. Jason Fung. Welcome to part 3 of the Diabetes Code Clinic, where we're focused on type 2 diabetes remission. We're trying to reverse the disease. If you didn't have a chance to review parts 1 and 2, you can go back and have a look where we talked about what type 2 diabetes is and also an introduction to low carbohydrate diets. Today, we're going to continue talking about low carbohydrate diets. Remember that the disease of type 2 diabetes is your body having too much glucose, which is a type of sugar. Imagine a barrel where you can put water in. The water's like that glucose, and the barrel's like your body. It can store a certain amount of this glucose, but when it's full, it's going to spill over. When it spills over, you see it in the blood. When you see the high blood glucose, you get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And where did that glucose come from? It came from your diet. So you got to look for the sources of sugar in your diet and get rid of it. That's why low carbohydrate diets can be so effective. The key point here is that some foods are going to raise your blood glucose and some foods don't raise your blood glucose. So you want to emphasize those foods that don't raise your blood glucose. And that's done by cutting down your carbohydrates. But what foods are high and what foods are low? You can certainly test it yourself using a blood glucose monitor, but you can also go to something called the glycemic index, which has been used for decades. And what the glycemic index is a scale of how much a certain food on average is going to raise your blood glucose. And it's a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being glucose, which is the most that your blood glucose goes up in response to that food. So 0 is good, 100 means that that food tends to maximally raise your blood glucose. And this is done by measuring a whole lot of people and taking the average response, but your own response may be different, which is why it may be useful to personalize it. There's something else called the glycemic load, which is also a very useful concept because it takes into account both the glycemic index and how much a typical portion of food is, because certain foods may have a very high glycemic index but a relatively low glycemic load because the typical portion just isn't that big. For example, carrots have a fairly high glycemic index of 70, but the glycemic load is relatively low at 4. And this is why it's important to take both of them into account. And you can find these lists on the internet. They're fairly easy and they're well accepted by anyone. So if we look at this glycemic index of foods, and you can look at these foods like chicken and butter and eggs and beef, and you'll notice those are mostly proteins and fats. And therefore, if you look at the glycemic index, it's 0. When you test large numbers of people, no matter how much chicken you eat or eggs or butter, the blood glucose on average goes up 0. That's great. So if you're eating a meal and you prioritize those foods, your blood glucose is not expected to go up at all. And that's because it's really just carbohydrate containing foods that are going to raise your blood glucose, because carbohydrates are sugar. You eat the sugar, your blood sugar goes up. Of the carbohydrates, there's still a very big difference between refined carbohydrates and natural carbohydrates. Those are the things that look like they do in nature. So refined carbohydrates might be things such as cornflakes, baguettes, and so on. A baguette doesn't grow on a tree. It doesn't grow on the ground. It has to be refined. And when you refine these carbohydrates, the glycemic index tends to be very high and the glycemic load tends to be very high because a lot of the refining makes it easier to digest and also tends to get rid of a lot of the fiber, the proteins, and the fats, leaving a relatively concentrated, pure form of carbohydrate. Therefore, when you eat it, the body can absorb it very quickly and you get this big spike of glucose. If you look at the glycemic index of a cornflakes, is very high at 85, and the baguette still very high at 95. And the glycemic load, which takes into account the portion size, is still very high, around 45 to 55. Now contrast them to natural carbohydrates, because people point out that, for example, cauliflowers and carrots, they're also carbohydrates, and absolutely they are. When you look at the carrot, its glycemic index might be very high, 70 to 85. If it's cooked, it's a little bit higher, but the glycemic load is down at 4. Cauliflower has a low glycemic index of only 15, and even lower when you get to glycemic load of only 0.8. Even foods that grow below the ground, things such as sweet potatoes and beets, which are starchy carbohydrates but they're natural, have a relatively high glycemic index, 65 to 70. But again, when you compare it to the glycemic load, you see that the glycemic load is much lower. It's down at 11 and 7, compared to white rice, which has a glycemic load of 56, or a baguette, which is 45. So natural carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates, there is a big difference. Cutting down total carbohydrates certainly is effective, but if you do have to eat some, choose the natural, whole, unprocessed carbohydrate, because it makes a big difference. And it's not just me saying that. You can see this American Heart Association scientific statement, which is just from 2022. And what they tell you is that very low carbohydrate diets compared to a more moderate carbohydrate diet yield greater decrease in A1C, meaning your blood sugars are on average better. People lose more weight and they use less diabetes medication. Well, that's great. Why wouldn't everybody follow this very low carbohydrate diet? The American Diabetes Association in 2020 published their consensus guidelines for nutrition therapy. And what they said is that reducing overall carbohydrate intake for individuals with diabetes has demonstrated the most evidence for improving glycemia, which means that no, these are not fad diets. These low carbohydrate diets actually have the most scientific evidence. More than any other diet, the low carbohydrate diet has demonstrated time and again in scientific studies to be the most important for reducing the blood sugars. Again, not very difficult. You don't eat the sugars, your blood sugars don't go up. And once again, if you look at their guidance, it says emphasize non-starchy vegetables, get rid of the added sugars and the refined grains, and choose whole foods. And you see that reflected in the glycemic index and the glycemic load. The carbs are sugar, and eating carbs is eating sugar, which raises your blood sugars. Try to eat total carbohydrates of less than 50 grams per day. The American Diabetes Association put out a pamphlet guiding people how to eat a very low carbohydrate diet. There are foods that have 0 carbohydrates, and these are going to be great because they're not going to raise your blood glucose. That's things like meats, beef, lamb, pork, veal, chicken, poultry, duck, goose, turkey, chicken, and then fish and shellfish as well, tuna, shellfish, that kind of thing. Foods that are very low in carbohydrates include leafy vegetables. So arugula, kale, spinach, watercress. And if they're less than 5 grams of carbohydrate per serving, you can really eat as much as you feel like. All of these non-starchy and leafy vegetables are very low in carbohydrates. And there's lots to choose from: bok choy, bean sprouts, cabbage, carrots, and all that kind of thing. You should look at your plate and try and fill half of it with those leafy, non-starchy vegetables and half of it with meats and proteins. You can alter it according to your taste, but again, both of those things are either 0 carbohydrate or very low in carbohydrates. And there are ways to make it easier for yourself. There are low carbohydrate starch alternatives. If you normally eat something on bread, for example, you could go with something such as a lettuce wrap. You can do that with a burger. Instead of having the bun, you just wrap it in lettuce. Many places will do that for you for no additional cost. You can do cauliflower crust. You can do things such as zoodles, which are the spiralized noodles. You can make cauliflower rice, where they shape your cauliflower in the same of rice, and it looks like it. And there are also things such as konjac noodles, which is a type of noodle that actually has zero carbohydrate. It's made of yams, sometimes called shirataki or miracle noodles. What happens if your blood glucose goes down? Well, that's good. That's exactly what we're trying to do. But if you're on medication, it might go too low. So you have to always monitor and be careful. Then you know you're being over medicated and you need to talk to your doctor about reducing those medications. But remember, if you're taking less medications and getting the same blood sugar, it means that your diabetes, your disease, is actually getting better. So those are the things to make it easy for yourself to follow a low carbohydrate diet. I hope you learned something. I'll see you at the next video.